todas y
Good
muchas
morning,
gracias por
everyone,
acompañarnos hoy.
and thank you for joining us today. I'm Eric Parrado. I'm Chief Economist and General Manager of the Research Department of the Inter-American Development Bank, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this event. And this is a special edition of BID Academy's Voices in Action, devoted to creativity. Today, we're in the gallery of the IDB's Cultural Center, and these galleries are very important. Since 1992, they've been conveying the importance of economic development through art, creativity, and culture. And today we have a very special guest, María José Machado. She's an artist, a university professor, and a cultural manager, among many other things. And Maria Jose has traveled. She actually arrived yesterday. I know it was an eventful journey, but she's come all the way from Cuenca and is joining us today in Washington, D.C. at this lovely cultural center. Welcome to Washington. Good morning to all those of you here. Thanks, Eric and team, for making it possible for me to be here, and thanks for those online. And yes, it's been quite eventful, but this has to do with the performance side of things for an artist. And so as to rev up our engines, perhaps you could tell us a bit about your background, and without giving any spoilers of the work we're going to look at in greater detail, how has this changed your life? I think this particular piece of work is very much connected to life. I feel that in the past 15 years, I've made a point of taking a social stance when it comes to my work. So I think these things are all related. So performance is something that has transcended the individual body. I think that community and relationship art has made me understand myself as part of a social body, symbolically speaking. And this work has ultimately changed me because during the pandemic, I actually left my cultural policy and management work to go back to academia at a time of crisis due to the health crisis with all of the virtual component. And this work changed me. I have a degree in art, in theory of philosophy of the arts, and I was convinced all along that I had to produce artwork and reflect on it. But this particular artwork helped me understand that education is the driver of change. In terms of art, being able to serve as a tool, and actually this was the subject matter of my research work, and now I'm focusing on innovation education as part of my doctoral studies. How interesting, Maria Jose. And let me say, of course, I imagine those of you here at the Cultural Center and those online may wonder what the chief economist is doing at this event, moderating a conversation on art. And I asked myself the same question when I was invited. And, you know, at the end of the day, what you need is to know about another context so as to see that the goal is the same. Your goal as a cultural manager and artist is to send a message in terms of the importance of the proper diagnosis with a view to change. And we, in a way, on our side, also try to aim at the same. We are both, in a way, on the same page, but we need to enhance our links. Tell us a bit more about your life as an artist and about all of the social interventions. I've learned a lot looking at all of your work. And there's also the cultural management side when it comes to the creative and somehow circular economy. I understand it better on the economy side, but on the cultural side of things, you might help us understand better. Yes, this is interesting. Sometimes we think a lot about continuing specialization. And I think especially in the post-pandemic phase, all research and career and other goals should not be decoupled from intuition. And actually, this work is based on quantitative and qualitative statistics. And this is a language that may sometimes be a lot closer to economists or to those who have a more scientific view. And we sometimes take a specific view of art in terms of understanding that it has performed a powerful function and has become entertainment in the world of capitalism. But it's about more than that. It breaks barriers when you think about the different landscapes that are conveyed through art. And, we talk about multidisciplinary approaches, but there's the social fabric underlying all of the diversity in our society. And what is creative economy? Going back to that point, I think Latin America has many westernizing views, but we haven't understood that without romanticizing precarious contexts, that there are statistics that show that there is no proper art market. I think it's complex to talk about high percentages of cultural industries or the orange economy ideals in Latin America. And I think, perhaps in a very personal way, I have started looking at the idea of the creative economy. Culture and art are not the same thing, but there's an interface, which is creativity as the common thread running through them. And that's when we talk about the consumers of culture, because generally those of us who produce and consume don't depend on private business or on state-owned business. In a way, we're a bit of a synergy system, and sometimes closed loop. We work on other facets of the economy: partnerships, affection, sustenance, exchanges. And we have also looked at the role of creative managers as something that necessarily requires more than one job, because there's no proper recognition of the values inherent in a work and of its actual value. Every creative person needs to rely on several job sources, because if we depend on just one thing or devote ourselves to one thing, it's more difficult. What opportunities do you see in the LAC region compared to other parts of the world when it comes to the creative and cultural economy? So what opportunities do you see? Do you see many opportunities? Yes, Latin America has diversity, and I think Latin America is the ideal way to go as an artist. There's the inspiration you can draw from the flavor of each territory, and you can, in inverted commas, steal. You can appropriate things ethically and without an extractive approach in order to create something new. I think it's good for us to try and understand others, to try to step into someone else's shoes. But in order to do that, we need to take off our own shoes. And I think that's a very powerful message when it comes to linking the economy to culture and to other areas. And another thing I think is also important is trying to reach agreements and national consensus to move towards the sorts of reforms that Latin America and the Caribbean needs. Because if we are polarized politically or in other respects without reaching agreement, it becomes very hard to advance towards economic development. And this is why we at the IDB, through our cultural center, have organized this exhibition about how to heal a broken world, which is about art and culture in order to try and envisage human possibilities, trying to reinvent collective imagination and see how development can be boosted through art and culture. In addition to your work, which we'll be discussing, we have the work of another 4 remarkable artists and creative collectors from the LAC region. Their works were especially commissioned for this exhibition, and they follow this metaphor conceived of by the curators, which has to do with healing a wound in 5 steps, which includes from cleaning the wound, that's the first step, all the way to take away the bandage once the wound has healed. So for all those of you watching us online, I would like to invite you to visit this wonderful space through the link to the virtual exhibition that we'll share on our chat. Another thing I could add, if we try to draw a comparison with economic issues, we have several open wounds nowadays. We have smaller wounds and we have much larger ones, and they're not yet healing. I would say that the smaller wounds that may be addressed have to do with inflation and government or public debt, and this is why we're working on this as a research focus. But then there's the much larger wounds that are harder to heal and have to do with inequality. And I think that is important, and that is something that is reflected by all of the exhibitions we have at the Cultural Center, and in particular by your own work, which I personally found impressive. I was privileged to see the work with María José yesterday, and we somehow had a chance to share views and ideas on what we are getting to experience. And one thing that particularly caught my attention had to do with this empty chair work of yours. I would like to talk about that. I think as part of the empty chair work, you visited many homes and schools in Cuenca, especially in suburban areas in Narancay and El Calvario. Could you tell us a bit about your work and how it fits into the framework of this exhibition on healing a broken world? Well, I was somehow in the middle. I wanted to prevent old wounds from becoming infected. And that is complicated. When you start looking at pain and at different situations in life, you think about the before and the after. You focus on the past and on the future. And the present is one of the hardest things to tackle because you don't know what to do. Throughout all of 2020 and well into early 2021, I decided not to produce any work because I thought it was a very delicate time to produce art. Focusing on the full lockdown context. And I live right next to a school, and I did at that time. And I always had this conflict related to the noise from schools, the national anthems, the children in their physical education classes, the bells going. And during the pandemic, there was hardly any noise, and someone left a window open, and there was a balloon, and I could see it was probably left over from a birthday party, and I could see the balloon deflating, and that noise became deafening to me. Everyone was thinking about when we were going to be able to go out, but no one was thinking about how we were living during lockdown. And, it was a privilege to be able to think about how you live in lockdown rather than having to worry about how to survive in lockdown. Well, that particular school closed down due to this crisis. And then, of course, I had to think about all the children with the school closing down. And at that time, I was getting into education. It was like a fizzy tablet, the question started to spread more and more in me. And then I started to look at the landscape, the places where students were attending virtual classes, some of them in restaurants or some asked to be allowed to leave a little earlier because they had just one device, where I had students with their two siblings helping them do their homework while they were in class too. So I think planning sometimes fails to understand the territory of users. And that was the approach of my work. Now, so I also got to understand that I was dealing with a context that I didn't know about. And I thought the responsible way to approach art was not to show the issues as something colorful, but rather to dive into the issues. And I had had some cultural management and art projects in El Calvario and Arancaya, which are suburbs of Cuenca. It's not very clear if they're rural or urban. They're kind of in limbo. So they were somehow underserved. And I had worked earlier with gender issues and young girls, and I was wondering what was happening to them. And if I may talk a bit about the artwork now, yes, tell us why we're sitting here on these desks, which are so clean. Yes, no scuff marks on the actual surface, no cribs or cheat notes inscribed on the desks. Well, precisely, there was no one to be able to etch anything into the desks because they were during the pandemic. Normally, these would be the sorts of arrangement you would see in a school class. Now, why the chair, which is what we can see behind us? In Ecuador, there's the empty chair, which is an arrangement that has been included as part of the decision-making process so that any citizen can use that chair when a decision is about to be made, and so that they can be engaged in the decision-making process. That chair is nearly always empty because people who have certain issues that afflict them, they are not very much aware of the protocols that can help them have access to a meeting with the decision makers in order to have a chance to take part in the process. And they may not even be aware of the availability of that chair, or those chairs are there, but they have to work in the schedule that you would normally have the decision-making meetings. And the empty chairs reflected that, because it's a bit like the deflating balloon. There were schools full of empty chairs at the time. And I think art has a lot to do with the internet and the transition going from cultural public policy back to the context of a public university in my work made me think about democracy, the law, and accessibility. And sometimes a right is really a privilege. And everyone was talking about methodologies, and people kept thinking about methodologies from a privileged position, having a computer, having a home, or ultimately having time to think about methods to address these issues. And of course, that is needed. But people who were having a rough time weren't being brought on board. There was no real appreciation of what it meant to live in lockdown. And, technical specialists will often not walk in the mulch because they work within an office, within a certain time slot. So that obviously influences their perception of the situation. So this work looks at different parts of the Cuenca canton, looking at the closed schools. And right now we have a chance to be together without wearing mouth coverings. After all, when we think about talking, to even to a stranger in the days of the pandemic was a very complex process because opening up your door at home was a risky act. And I talked to children, to parents, and to teachers from both public and private schools. I asked them how they were experiencing online education, what complexities they had encountered, and how they thought things were going to unfold. And you have here anything from 4 to 5 year olds all the way to 70-year-olds. And we had 4 or 5 audio recordings to go with this. In a way, it was about us going to reach out and meet the recipients or the intended audiences, because if we didn't do that, then we weren't going to be able to get what we wanted. That was, in a way, the spirit of what we did. We at the IDB have talked a lot about the macroeconomic and sectoral impact of the pandemic, but Maria Jose's work puts a human face on the figures. As I said, I saw her yesterday, and it's amazing to see all of the messages condensed into 15 minutes as part of a very profound sort of work. And again, as you said, you have messages from a 4-year-old boy to teachers at schools, and a little boy, when asked how he had experienced the pandemic, he said it's very lonely. So the impact is not just educational, but also in terms of mental health. And I think somehow it has affected us all. One important point, too, is the fact that your message is very powerful in terms of trying to identify where the privileges are. So this means trying to step into the shoes of someone else. And of course, there are gender issues, but privileges are invisible to those who hold the privileges. And that's an important message, too, related to the closing of schools. And of course, your message is more on the human side. And we, through our research, have the figures. And schools in Latin America and the Caribbean were closed for much longer than in any other region, North America, Europe, Oceania. So the average of school closing time in our region was 8 months, whereas the average for the rest of the world was just 3 months. So consider that difference. And in terms of the impact on learning, it has been brutal. There are estimates in the case of Sao Paulo, for instance. It is estimated that the learning loss is equivalent to a whole full year of education. In Mexico, it is a year and a half of lost learning. So the impact has been massive and brutal, and Maria Jose's work somehow summarizes that, and very well. But let us try and look on the bright side of things in terms of the pandemic. And one good thing we may find is digitalization. In aggregate, average terms, digitalization has increased a lot. We have recently launched a report at the bank, which is about the digitalization of public services. And let us hope on the chat you'll be able to find the link to access this. But on digitalization, is it helping bridge the inequality gaps, or could that also compound them? Well, it was interesting to hear what you said. I think the most powerful thing about the work is that the artist disappears as a figure. What is most important is what resounds there. You know, there's no scripting there. It's a kid who says it's a little lonely. And then you get this lady who says, I can't help them. My kids haven't finished school. How can I help them? They can't even use a computer. And for instance, the fact that the absence of generations who have no access to education leads to violence, to scarcity, and to a major school and education lag in Latin America. And now, if we want to think in economic terms, there's a whole generation that has to revitalize the economy of the region. And there's this absence of knowledge. It's not just about being able to read or to add or do sums. It's about the neural educational consequences of the absence of education. There's a huge gap there.
And this is one thing that it's not just about that is not broached is as dropout. School dropout is something that is not dealt with because it's like the layers in an onion where we have to strip them off, knowing that we will shed tears every time we see one and we open it. It's not that the other way around where you see that onions will produce a new dish or something. We have been focusing in Latin America on digitizing schools, online instruction, but nothing has been done in real terms to fight attrition. Those kids that never went back to school or that never that were held back in schools. So there is a huge financial gap. And children and children and adolescents, they went to work. They didn't go into higher education, for example. And digitization, of course, it has been approached as an emergency measure, but no teachers were in a position or qualified to provide responsible education under such circumstances, and that created a dual gap in education. So solutions, in my view, are not just about getting kids back to school, about going back to those empty seats, but also how are we going to fill those gaps in terms of the digital divide. I think that digitization is an option, online is an option, but I think that we need to view things from different standpoints. Those who are in the outskirts and the suburbs of cities, those who are incarcerated have no access to innovative tools. And when I was doing research for this work of art, one of the technical experts at the Ministry of Education, together with a journalist, were interviewing, let's say they were interviewing a mother. What do you think about online classes and this innovation launched by the Ministry of Education? And she said, listen, I can't even afford to pay my water bill. What are you talking about? So sometimes I don't think that the questions are not well posed, but rather the approaches preceding those questions are not well planned out. So that's why I started out with bringing kids back to school. There are so many tools available. Costa Rica provided tablets to children or free internet access. I don't think we should be paternalistic here, but I do think that we need to acknowledge the fact that education is a right. And how do we turn this into a policy and a duty-based policy? Because otherwise, what you're creating is another empty chair, another empty seat. These tools are there for online access to education, but let's say there's only one teacher in a whole school to deal with all of the elementary school children. How can you ask them to train children from grade 1 to 7 without a computer and without internet access? I mean, it's impossible. Of course. And now during the World Cup, it's like playing, going to the World Cup, but having no national team. So That's what it's about, in my opinion. So there's a need for development, but we need to understand the actual structure needed for development to really happen. And I love what you said, because at the end of the day, public policy has to be well designed to allow for the impact that is there on paper to be felt in real terms, and actions must be put in place to improve lives, as we say at the bank. You can write whatever you want, but one of the things that we saw a few years ago, and we said was, let's assess, one of our projects was to assess whether giving computers to children had an actual impact on learning. And guess what? It didn't. That's what we found, because it means nothing to have a computer if it comes without training for the teachers and support for the school. So there must be actual comprehensive support. Yes, Chomsky actually said that. He compared the internet to a hammer. If you have a hammer, you can destroy something or you can build something. So if you just let someone loose with a tool in their hands and they don't know what it's for, it will be useless. So that tablet computer, the internet access, or or understanding digitization as a tool, as a way forward. Sometimes we think that wounds can be healed by simply having healed what actually wounded me, what actually hurt me, instead of thinking ahead about what can heal future wounds. So when we talk about digitization, we're all obsessed with the fact that digitization is a must. And we're acting out of fear, basically, out of resistance. But we haven't thought about maybe metacognition developments, or the basic principle, which is using a reverse model of learning, not just students, but learners, and not just teachers, but rather knowledge engineers. Education is a challenge in and of itself. As I was saying, teachers are knowledge engineers. What have they learned about from the pandemic? That they're a coach, that they're a leader, that they're a role model, but also not only in terms of knowledge, but also education in general. People say that children don't pay attention. They're in bed, eating, doing something else, playing on the computer while they were in class. So we're going back to digital online behavioralism, and nobody understands the challenges brought about by metacognition and the responsibility that comes with emotional care vis-a-vis intellectual development for humankind as a whole, which, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, is broken. And so if we don't deal with this, there's a wound, and a wound always leaves a scar. People just overlook the scar. But of course, what is the idea? Do we want to just cover it up? That's not the idea. What we need to do is do as the Japanese art of Kazumi does. We need to fix it with gold. And that's where the banks come in. That's where researchers come in. And indicators are being built that are devoid of effect. And I'm not talking about affection. I'm talking about affect, not affection, this romantic idea of love and affection. I'm talking about social care, about support, about containment, about art. Art, research, policy alone cannot be built without bearing in mind whether that other person can do what you're planning for them. And it's very important. This is an important segue to the issue of trust or lack thereof. The latest flagship publication that we have from the bank is about trust, because we don't trust our governments, we don't trust our political systems, we don't trust our congresses, and we don't trust each other. And when there is no trust, it is very, very hard to move forward on certain issues, especially development, which are so dear and near to us. And your work really focuses on trust in a way, and the empty chair that creates a venue for those without a voice to be involved in decision making at a school or some other institution or organization. And the main conclusions that we drew within this flagship publication is that information must be provided and disseminated to all, and it must also empower. And that's the most daunting challenge that our region is faced with. And that goes hand in hand with the empty chair, and how, culturally speaking, what can be done to move forward in this regard? So trust. Yesterday and today, I was reading an article by Francisco Mora. He's a neuroscientist, is a doctor, and of course, I borrow from others. And I was thinking about neuroeducation and about how spectators understand things, because you have to understand and bear in mind how somebody else's brain works, so and understands and faces what you're planning for them. So he said, when something happens, there are three different options, three different things that could happen. You either flee, or say you run, or you take cover, or you face it. And all three are intuitive options. They have to do with emotional issues. And let's say something were to happen here. What if this were to blow up? Let's say we can take cover, or we run. And one thing is for you to run, and a different thing is for us to hide or take cover. They're different things. So this idea of protection, mutual or individual protection, is based on neuroscience. It's about understanding, what if I flee? I'll take you by the hand and take you with me. So I wouldn't go by myself. So trust is science. It's about science. And it's understood as raw material for research through affect and emotion. And we talk about this toxic positivism of affection. You know, everybody loved each other. Animals were coming back to our cities. They were taking them over. It's time to embrace again. And as soon as people were let out into the streets, they went back to life as usual, to business as usual. They went to the subway. They went away. But most importantly, with their wounds just opened for all to see. And I wonder whether that answers your question. Yes, of course, because everything you're saying just complements our ideas and it ties in with them. But what I really liked about your work, about the empty chair, is to give a voice or a venue for expression for those who did not have a voice or were not aware of the fact that they could be heard. And that's very important for us here in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's very important to have social cohesion so that we can foster this. You talked about privilege, right? Privileges are invisible to those who have them, and rights are invisible for those who are not aware of the fact that they're entitled to them. You're right. So just so you see, art and economics are not completely divorced from disciplines. So María José, let's see if we have questions from the audience, people here with us in presence or online. And there are so many other questions that I have in mind for you. We could keep talking forever, but I wonder whether we have any questions from the audience first. I see that there is a question about your suggestions. What are your suggestions for young artists, aspiring young artists? When we, in our conversation, we mentioned that you are a teacher, and you teach students, and you showcase their work, and oftentimes artists do not want to give much visibility to others' work. But what but you're not like that. So what is your advice to those who is aspiring artists and about social function? I think that social function and work is a duty. If culture is a right, then this is a duty. Art is a duty because it creates mechanisms for development of and the enjoyment of this duty. So, what we talked about lack of. Also unhappiness with public policy, and why? Because oftentimes people they privatize policy, and say at a university such as the one where I work, people they don't trust. They come with open wounds, gaping wounds. Let's say my parents didn't have a good job, I didn't get good education in school, and unhappiness does create a whole issue, and that sees this education as a system that has failed, and not about how to hack the system. You know, you have to become, first of all, very conversant, very familiar with the system. No hacker can hack into a system before they become familiar with it. So from the point of view of medicine, education, art, you know, the arts, oftentimes we carry that load that say, oh no, that's for artists, that's for art to take care of. And that's for artists to do, people think sometimes. But I believe that artists need to learn to speak responsibly and not speak from unhappiness and non and discontentment. So you have information, you have this, you see things, and then you speak. You know, let's say during the pandemic, you saw that the schools had shut down, and you saw that there was a challenge to learning, and then you worked on your work of art, and that lends credibility to what is being said and expressed through art, right? I think that observing has to do with sympathy and altruism, but not just in the area of the arts. You, as an economist, for example, you don't come to the bank to work just because you get paid for it. You get paid for your time. You're not being paid just for your knowledge. You're being paid for the time you're devoting from your years of life to do that. I am sorry the question is off mic. We will resume interpretation as soon as we have proper sound. The English booth apologizes. I'm sorry, you interrupted me. I didn't really get your question, and I lost my train of thought. But if I may, Pamela, I think that sympathy and altruism are important. Empathy and altruism are important because that makes you aware of what you're doing. You're not working for yourself here. Let's say you have a hair salon or a bakery, or you may be the manager of a bank, but you're doing something for society as at large. So what we've lost is the essence of working and being part of and coexistence. And because of capitalism, you know, we all have a social function, and our motto at the bank is improving lives. That's what we work for day in and day out at the bank. It's a personal commitment, but also an institutional commitment. Can we have the question again, please? Unfortunately, the interpreters cannot hear the question. We will resume interpreting as soon as we can hear the speaker. So I think that there are different issues at play there. First of all, I think there are three ways we can approach this from the public, private, and independent standpoints. Let's start with the third one. Independents do not want to connect to the public or the private spheres. They say it's in poor taste sometimes to connect the money and capital to art. So the cultural sector has basically closed in on itself, and there's a need for trust and when it comes to the economy. So I think they have not been able to include themselves in the public-private sphere. You know, we're different from each other. I'm not like you. And let's say what they think is, oh no, you're a capitalist and I'm there out on the streets. But being a rebel can also lead to colonization when there is no negotiation allowed for in terms of dissidence. And I'm being self-critical here. In the private sphere, art and culture have always been intended for a public, for an audience, not for the spectator, for the onlooker. So sometimes it has to do with the company supporting or sponsoring an artist, or how much the company stands to gain from, maybe in tax terms, tax exemptions or tax breaks, or some other type of financial gain from supporting an artist. So based on these two types of logic, culture and art has focused on this. And for the state, culture and art has been seen as an expense, not an investment, because it does not lead to better indicators, so to speak. There's no feedback there. And most of the events funded by the state are not, I mean, they're not free, they're subsidized. So as soon as we see state subsidies and art for art and culture as a right, and we also bear in mind the independence and the private factor, what is created is noise, and that prevents consensus from being attained. So when we talk about art and culture, we talk about diversity. If I were to ask you what culture and art means to you, you will come up with a different answer for each person in here. Since it's not hard science, we have not been able to reach a consensus due to the polysemics of this debate as to what is what dissemination means. And people say, oh, there's not enough dissemination. What they mean is we're lacking the necessary investment, capital investment for that to happen. And we, of course, art is something that you cannot silence. You can't silence art. So investing in art and its dissemination is also taking a major risk. But being willing to listen to others, even when they're saying something that you might not like, is also an act of trust. So what are your new projects? What's coming up? What kind of risks will you be taking? Will you continue to research social functions through these interventions, action and art? Right. This is like when grandmothers used to braid your hair, you know? You divide it into three. There's education, there's cultural management, and then there's technology. I don't see feasibility in this braid without all three. As you know, we need that strong braid, the strong woman, that, well, the reins that you use to whip your horse or your mule. Without all three elements, we can't do it. Now I'm working on a project with education and community related processes, which will be launched this year. This year, I will unveil my latest work. And I think we need to slow down also. So I have been focusing in my work and my knowledge with humility on cultural management and art based on my students, on my learners. I trust that they have to be our new employers. They need to be our critics. Is there a question here? There's a question. Vanessa Alfonso Rodriguez, I'm an architect. Good morning. I'm writing from Colombia. Could you please elaborate on how art can help consolidate creative districts in cities by fostering the economic development in a region? Is how art helps create creative districts? Is that the question? If I understood that correctly, I guess that's a good view and approach. You know, it comes from where you come from. You know, architecture, of course, is all about landscapes and the distribution and urban planning. It's important to create districts, but even more important, is to create cities. If we talk about, if we continue to think in terms of piloting, what we have in mind is, and where we stop, is at prototypes, at the prototype level. I think we're focusing too much on prototypes and not on permanent implementations. And this goes back to Luis's question. In processes around culture, because they haven't not been successful at sustaining themselves and vindicating the position of art, every time there's a change in public administration, a new administration comes in, everything starts over from scratch. So each government has its own piloting experience. So there are no long-lasting projects. The plans for the 2030 goals for the SDGs do include culture, and there are some very specific parameters and basic milestones. And of course, you can write what you will, but culture uses different territories to show us through culture that things can be done. But even if it's a matter of the community, it's more event-based, because there are no districts about, there are no civil engineer districts or whatever gender. Why do they have to be about culture? If culture permeates territory as a whole, I mean, it's necessary. I work in a high security, maximum security prison. So culture is about arts and crafts. It's about doing something on your spare time. Is that right? No, that's insensitive. I was talking, to someone who's like, they were running around in the rat race, and all of a sudden we look at this empty chair and we go back to the classroom. Is this a debate for academia only? No, not at all. It's something for cities. This debate is a debate meant for cities. I'm not criticizing the fact that there might be districts, but I think that we should see art throughout as a more latent presence. I also think that we should have a longer term vision that is not based or dependent on political cycles, which in the region are very short, 2 to 3 years, and then they fall through. They do not survive over the long term. All we have left is a few minutes before we wrap up. So first of all, I would like to ask you to send out a closing message about your work, about the next steps for you, and also a message for our audience here today about this combination, about being an artist, a university professor, and a cultural manager. I always need to participate. I mean, let's say if there's a hand raised, somebody is raising their hand. Do you have a question? I can't wrap up before I hear your question. Right. So here it is. I will be your voice. How do you envision a coordination between art and human rights based on your hybrid experience, education, art, development, art? I will say goodbye by answering your question. I think that human rights are pivotal and they should not just be dead letter. I think that it is our mission to take on to lift ourselves by our bootstraps, but we cannot just protect our own rights. Are we going to flee together and hide together, take cover together, or are we going to do it separately? I think that human rights are so obvious that they become invisible, just like ourselves. You're so visible, so obvious, your body, yourself, that you forget about your own existence. And how possible is it for you to even understand that others are there? I mean, why am I out there? Why do I get out of bed every morning and go to work? So you have to ask yourself. I think the territories where there's most violence, people are incarcerated, where there are gaps, the nobodies, the pariahs in policy, state policy and even private policy, those who don't know, those who are illiterate about their rights, about the law. I think they need to be humanized. And that's why we need art so badly. I'm not saying that we're not humanized, that we're not sensitive, but art sometimes will allow us to slow down. And by slowing down, based on just, it's this Japanese philosophy of bringing down the pace so that we can see, listen to others, understand what they're saying, and braid your own braid. Thank you, María José. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I think we have all enjoyed it thoroughly here at the Cultural Center and for those following us online. I know I speak on behalf of all of us. This is an BID Academy Voices in Action event, and I think this was very interesting. Your whole project is very interesting, very ambitious, of bringing together several areas in the interest of economic development, which is what we want for our region. So thank you for being with us today. Please do not forget to fill out our online survey. The link is in the chat so that we can improve in terms of ideas, new guests, and also the relationships we can have between the bank and other organizations and people. So hopefully this exchange, this session, which was very interesting. I mean, on a personal level, it's been so interesting to get to know you. Hopefully this will be just an example of what we can do in the area of culture and development and bringing together different areas with a view to improving the lives of all of the citizens in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you so much to everyone.